So today was the first day of the very first trial involving an ASR hip implant. It's a case against DePuy brought by an individual named Lauren Kransky. Mr. Kransky lives in Montana. He had his hip implanted, DePuy ASR, in December of 2007 and had some problems with the hip after it was put in. And just so you know, this was his second hip implant. He had a metal and plastic hip put in on the other side. Had some problems with the hip, and then in August of 2010, or the winter of 2010, he finds out about the ASR recall. He has some blood tests done, and it's determined that his cobalt and chromium levels are in the 40s and 50s. Now, at that point, a decision is made to take the hip out, and he has a revision surgery. So today was the opening argument in the case, and there were two attorneys that gave opening arguments. The first is Mike Kelly, who is a very well-respected trial attorney who was representing the plaintiff in the case. And on the defense side, there was an attorney named Alex Calfo. And both of them, I thought, did a very good job of explaining their stories and their client's position in the case. We learned a lot in the opening argument about the evidence that the plaintiffs intend to present at the trial. Mike Kelly did a very good job of describing these hips and how poorly they have performed compared to alternative hips. The evidence that he cited in his opening was that there have been 33,000 hips put in, and these are ASR hips put in the United States. And of those, almost 7,000 have been replaced at this point, which is a significant number. He also pointed to some internal J&J documents during his opening that talk about the expected revision rates for these hips. And the numbers he quoted were 37% at 4.5 years, and about 49% of the hips will be replaced at 7 years. And this was compared to traditional metal on plastic hips that have a much lower revision rate, which is usually about 1% per year. So you would expect a 7-year revision rate for a traditional metal on plastic hip to be about 7%, not 49%. The other thing he talked about during his opening that I thought was very powerful was the lack of testing that had been done on the ASR before it had been released to the public. He talked about how before the hip was released, there was a group of scientists and engineers who got together to do a risk assessment to evaluate all the things that could go wrong with this hip. And it turns out that the person at DePuy leading this group, the person in charge of assessing the risk, had absolutely no experience at all with medical devices. He had only been at DePuy for a short period of time, and before he was hired at DePuy, he had worked for a company that manufactured car brakes. No experience at all with medical devices or hips or medication or anything health related. And that was the person in charge of the testing process. He also talked about how the hip had never really been tested in humans. It had only been tested on machines, and the limitations that imposes. The tests on the machines, to make matters worse, were also done in essence under ideal circumstances. They only tested one size hip, and they had the hip at the ideal angle and tested it in a machine. And according to Mr. Kelly, that was insufficient to really duplicate or simulate what would happen in a human body. He also talked about what DePuy knew and when it knew it. And it was obvious that he was setting up an argument that punitive damages should be awarded in this case. And I thought this part of his opening statement was definitely the most powerful. He had lots of internal emails, memos, test results showing that DePuy knew there were problems with his hip in early 2003. when it had been released in Europe. That surgeons in Europe and salesmen in Europe were sending emails back to headquarters indicating that there were serious problems with these hips, that they were shedding metaparticles, that some doctors were refusing to use it, and some of them were reporting very high revision rates. The other thing Mr. Kelly talked about and presented some evidence of at the trial was that in 2008, after receiving all these reports, DePuy actually knew there were problems with this hip and were thinking about redesigning it. There are several emails that Mr. Kelly spoke about showing that when these issues arose, the number one concern, at least it appeared from these emails, the number one concern of DePuy was not patients but actually profits. And there was a lot of analysis, financial analysis that was being done to determine how much it would cost to redesign the hip or recall the hip or take it off the market. And it appears from these emails that the decision was made always with the interest of profits foremost in the thoughts of the DePuy executives. Now, after what was very interesting about these opening arguments is that the situation of Mr. Kransky is very unique and is a little different than most of the cases that are out there right now. People have DePuy ASRs. Mr. Kransky was a Vietnam veteran and was exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam and had a huge list of serious health problems that predated the time that he got his hip. So what ended up happening was during the time period that he had the hip and before it was taken out, he had had heart problems that required heart surgery, kidney failure, kidney surgery, cancer, a huge host of problems. Now, Mr. Kelly, in his opening, made it very clear, and repeated this multiple times, that the plaintiff in the case would not be asserting that any of his heart problems, kidney problems, cancer, any of those things were caused by the hip. And he made that very clear. What the case is about it's about the hip and the surgery that Mr. Kransky needed that he otherwise wouldn't need. So what was odd about the opening was when Mr. Calfo got up to speak to present DePuy's part of the case, he spent almost an hour and a half talking about all of these health problems and how that the plaintiffs have already asserted are not part of this case. He spent about an hour and a half talking about those health problems and explaining why they couldn't have been caused by the DePuy hip. And it was almost like two ships passing in the night. One side was saying, we're not claiming his kidney problems were caused by his hip, and the other side is explaining why his kidney problems were not caused by his hip, an issue that didn't seem to be in dispute. Where I think the other side got their most traction was when they talked about the circumstances of Mr. Kransky's revision surgery. And there's an argument that they have been making, or that they intend to make at trial, that in essence Mr. Kransky's revision surgery was lawyer-driven. That because he couldn't find a surgeon in his area, in Montana, to perform the surgery, that he went to a surgeon that his lawyer had retained in the past, and they convinced that surgeon to do the surgery. In essence, arguing he never needed the revision surgery in the first place. The evidence on the other side of that was his very high cobalt and chromium levels. They were in the 40s, which is very, very high. And it's very high for somebody who's got a whole bunch of other health problems. So that, I think, counters that argument. The other thing was when the surgeon went in and did the surgery, they actually had a photographer there to take some pictures. And in the pictures you can see that there's evidence of staining and problems with the hip. The other problem with the case, from the plaintiff's perspective, is that according to Mr. Calfo, there's some testimony that the doctor, when he made his operative report of that surgery, was told by Mr. Kransky's lawyer what to put in the operative report. And this was a lawyer, not the lawyers who are actually trying the case right now. This was a local lawyer in Montana that Mr. Kransky had retained when he initially found out he had a recalled hip. So it's an interesting case. I don't know if there are going to be any other cases out there that are similar to this. At least from our standpoint, we don't have any clients that have the enormous health problems that Mr. Kransky had. And we also do not have any cases where we have this issue of lawyers being involved in revision surgeries. All of our cases that we represent several hundred people, involve people who on their own went and got revision surgery and then called us when they found out they needed it. So at the end of the day, is this going to be a really good what we call test case or not is questionable. If the plaintiffs lose, I think a lot of the blame will be placed on sort of Mr. Kransky's unique health issues and the circumstances that led to his revision surgery. If the plaintiffs win, I think there might be at least a belief on the defense side that the reason a jury came back with an award in his favor is because they felt sorry for him, because he is very sick, and he's sick today. He actually has cancer and doesn't have much longer to live. So whether this case is going to be a breakthrough case or not and will result in settlements of other cases remains to be seen.